Policy of January 3rd, 2017. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 22 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm joined today by Jared Huffman from California, and eventually I think Brendan Boyle from Philadelphia, the home of the new NFC champions, is also going to join us. And what we're going to talk about is really, what are the Republicans afraid of? What is it that they're hiding? What do they think, is going on with respect to this investigation of the president and his ties to Russia? And it starts from the very beginning. This time last year, we asked the president, are you going to turn over your tax returns so that people can see what's in your tax returns? Whether you have relationships with the Russians or who knows who. Every president for the last 40 or 50 years has turned over their tax returns. But of course, the president did not turn over his tax return, has refused to turn over his tax returns. And so the first thing you say is, well, what's in there? What are you hiding? Well, now what we see is a concerted effort by the Republicans in the Congress and in the White House to smear and disparage hardworking law enforcement officers in the FBI, in the intelligence community, at the Department of Justice, who have been tasked with trying to figure out whether or not Russia involved itself criminally in our elections last year, and whether or not there's any implication of the Trump campaign with respect to those particular efforts by the Russians. And so we need to make sure that Russia does not hack into our elections, does not participate in a way that favors one party over another or one candidate over another. And so these investigations started. The first thing the president did was fire Jim Comey from the FBI. Through a process, the Justice Department then appoints a special prosecutor, a special counsel, to continue this investigation. And since that's occurred, there have been a couple of indictments and a couple plea agreements. So Michael Flynn, who was the intelligence head for the president, has faced part of this investigation. Paul Manafort and Richard Gates, who were involved with the campaign, and then George Papadopoulos. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. All these people, both on the Trump campaign side and all of these Russians, have played some kind of a role, and this investigation must be pursued. And my friends on the Republican side of the aisle can complain, can stomp their feet, can throw mud at the individuals who are asked to do these investigations, but these investigations must continue so that the people understand exactly what happened, and to make sure that the Russians are not allowed to participate and infiltrate and affect our elections once again. So, just really three questions, or a couple questions in a statement. What are you afraid of? What are you hiding? Why? Is there a cover-up of some kind here? The bottom line is just let our law enforcement individuals do their detective work, do what they were asked to do, and leave them alone and let it be done. And if it exculpates and it proves that nothing happened, then great. But if there's some wrongdoing here, America needs to know about it. And with that, I'd yield to my friend from Northern California, Mr. Huffman, for as much time as he wants to consume.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Colorado, and I thank you for organizing this special order hour conversation. You asked the right question. What are they hiding and what are they afraid of? Now, it's a bit of a rhetorical question because when you think about that chart you've displayed there, when you think about the indictments and the plea deals and all of the other information that we're beginning to glean, it's pretty obvious what they're afraid of and what they're hiding. This investigation is getting pretty darn close to the personal and political and financial ties between this presidency and those around him and Russia. And it's a lot of information that they don't want the world to know about. And that's why we're seeing all of these distractions, all of these elaborate and increasingly desperate attempts to change the subject and create diversions. And frankly, today, my colleagues, I'm very worried that not so much that this is coming from our president, because we've seen him throughout his career engage in character assassination and burning down the house tactics and all manner of ruthlessness. But I'm disturbed that many of our colleagues here in this body have taken up those same tactics and that same cause. And that's dangerous, because one of the great things about this country, I believe, is that it's about the rule of law. Our founders actively debated this question about whether we would be a country of laws and institutions or a country of men. Would we have some people above the law, or would we all be subject to the law? And they answered it loud and clear. We were going to be a country of laws and institutions, and at every critical test in our history, we have reaffirmed that essential great aspect of what it is to be the United States of America. That's what Watergate was all about. As we are beginning to remember. And yet, today, it seems that that proposition is being retested all over again, and to my dismay, some of our colleagues are hoping for a different answer as we retest that proposition this time, and that's very troubling. Now, I'm not in the habit of quoting Fox News very often, and certainly not their news hosts, but one of their hosts, Shep Smith, said something that really struck a chord in the last few days. Here's what he said about the so-called Nunes memo. A memo can be a weapon of partisan mass distraction. That's exactly what this is, a desperate attempt to protect President Trump from investigation and accountability. And I think we need to recap a few facts that brought us to this point. Back in November 2016, when the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee was appointed to President-elect Trump's transition team, he, like our president, started sowing doubts about whether Russia had interfered with the 2016 election, incorrectly claiming that there was some kind of disagreement between our intelligence agencies on the subject. In fact, there was no disagreement. All of the American intelligence community agreed. As they had looked into this, they determined that Russian operatives had worked to undermine the integrity of our election. That conclusion has been reinforced and reaffirmed by everything we've learned since then. Now, the chairman told Politico shortly before President Trump's inauguration that the House should not investigate contacts between Russia and the Trump camp, even though his Senate intelligence counterparts had already committed to following the facts wherever they may lead. So he had already made up his mind. The chairman described the Trump-Russia connections as a dead trail. He said there's nothing there. And of course, we know President Trump has said he has nothing to do with Russia. Totally contradicted by everything we have learned since. All of this, of course, is going to come as a surprise that there's nothing there to the president's campaign chair, who is under indictment, to members of his family who have been hauled before the special prosecutor to answer to secret meetings and other dealings that they've had with Russia, and to others in this administration who had repeated contacts with Russia. And of course, no one can forget the intelligence chairman's trip to the White House last year, where he staged an impromptu news conference claiming that he had briefed the White House about a source who could explain how Trump campaign officials were caught up in foreign intelligence intercepts. His unnamed sources that he rushed to brief the White House about, well, turned out they were White House officials. This was a completely choreographed stunt. They had planted the misleading information with the chairman in the first place, obviously desperate to give some cover to the president who had tweeted out about wiretapping and conspiracies, and on it goes. So to my colleague Ed Perlmutter, you're asking all the right questions. This investigation is beginning to answer those questions in very, very important ways. And we need to make sure that it runs its course. It's important to finding out the truth. The American people deserve to know the truth. It's also important to reaffirming that incredibly important aspect of what makes this country great, and that is that we're a nation of laws and institutions. We've got to reaffirm that, unfortunately, over and over again from time to time. And with that, I yield back.
Well, and taking my time back, and I thank my friend from California. You were talking about this memo, and one of the former chairmen of the House Intelligence Committee, a guy named Mike Rogers, was also a panelist, I think, on a CNN program. And apparently this memo is going to be released today against all sort of norms with respect to the Intelligence Committee and classified information. And his words were, releasing a memo like this is farcical. It is a mistake. It starts to undermine so many things with respect to our intelligence community, the trust that we have with our allies, and all of it to kind of put up this smokescreen. They go after the law enforcement agents who are the detectives on the beat. Now they're releasing information that is incomplete and, in Mike Rogers' words, farcical, to try to distract, divert, avoid the real conversation, which is, what did the Russians do? How did they play in the elections? Was there any kind of cooperation, collusion, whatever it might be, with the Trump campaign? And we know that Bob Mueller was appointed. He's been a lifelong Republican, and everybody embraced his position as special counsel when it first came about, but quickly the president was thinking about firing him. Now people want to smear all of this. It's a mistake. The real question is, what are you hiding? And my friend from Philadelphia, Mr. Brendan Boyle, who is a pretty happy camper because his Eagles are going to be playing in the Super Bowl on Sunday, he has some questions too. And so with that, I'd yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I do, and I thank my colleague and friend's belief early on in the season in the Eagles, despite the fact he's a diehard Broncos fan. And the Super Bowl will be a nice diversion from the seriousness of the subject that we're discussing and debating tonight. Let me take us back a bit to a couple events that, yes, may have happened a little bit before I was born, but I know well as a student of American history, because I fear that we are on the verge of repeating them, possibly only days away from the verge of repeating them. In October 1973, after the Watergate investigation was being conducted by the special counsel Archibald Cox, it had been going on at that point for most of 1973. On a Saturday night, President Nixon decided to fire the special counsel, in part because the special counsel was doing his job and was getting too close to uncovering the conspiracy. President Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire the special counsel. The attorney general proved to be a profile in courage and refused. It then went to the deputy attorney general. The deputy attorney general refused. Finally, the number 3 man, Solicitor General named Robert Bork, decided that he would follow what President Nixon wanted and fired Archibald Cox. That became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. When John Chancellor, then the anchor for NBC News, came on the air, and I was recently rewatching this, he said, "Tonight I utter words I never thought I would say, but we are in the midst of the greatest constitutional crisis in the history of the Republic." I fear that history may very well repeat itself. We now know, since we were last in session, and it has been reported and confirmed by many media outlets, including Fox News, that President Trump has ordered his own White House attorney to fire the special counsel. Why? If the president really has nothing to hide, then why would he fire the special counsel and want to bring this process to an end? It gets back to the very first question that my colleague from Colorado has asked: what does he have to hide? I sincerely hope that the special counsel will find and will prove that nothing happened. That would be the best outcome and best course for all of us as Americans. But boy, if the president is innocent, he sure isn't acting like it. And we must come together as Democrats and Republicans second, but as Americans first, and do what is in the best interest of justice and of this country, and say the special counsel must be allowed to continue his work until its natural conclusion. If the president moves to fire the special counsel, that by its very definition is obstructing justice. This body and the other body on the other side of this building cannot allow that to happen. And here's the good news. In Watergate, ultimately the American people didn't let it happen. There was such an outcry on a bipartisan basis that within 48 hours, President Nixon had relented and appointed another special counsel, Leon Jaworski, who ended up being just as dogged, pursued the president all the way to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that President Nixon had to hand over the tapes, even though 3 of the 8 justices were Nixon appointees. President Nixon, actually to his credit, complied with that Supreme Court order, released the tapes, including a few tapes that clearly proved he was guilty, the so-called smoking gun. And within about a week or two, had resigned in August of '74. We can prevent that history from repeating itself if we act here in Congress to ensure there is a proper procedure in place to protect the integrity of this investigation. And if that does not take place, there will be, I predict, an outcry among the American people you have not seen or heard since October 1973. This country and its institutions are a heck of a lot more important than any political party. And it's about time all of us in this body act in such a way that shows we believe in those words. I yield back.
I thank my friend from Pennsylvania. The history lesson you just reminded us about, your words are ones that really, I don't think I can add anything to it. I'd ask my friend from Northern California if he has anything else to add, but I just want the speaker to know, and I want this chamber to know, we're not going to go away. We're not going to allow things to be hidden. We're not going to allow things to be covered up. This has got to run its full course, just as my friend said. So with that, I'd yield to my friend from California, who I think will then yield to the speaker.
I will, and I thank the gentleman. We are being taken back to the lessons of Watergate tonight. The system worked in the 1970s. The checks and balances that our founders put in place took effect. The public stepped up, the media stepped up, people of conscience in important positions within the government stood their ground and did the right thing. But I think it would be foolish for us not to take the threats of this moment in our history very, very seriously, because there are some things at play this time around that weren't there in the 1970s. You did not have right-wing media organs out there actively trying to undermine public trust in our government. You did not have a complicit United States Congress that, instead of doing oversight, seems to be spending more of its effort running cover for the administration, trying to hide the facts, trying to block investigations, playing tribal politics at its worst instead of fulfilling our institutional role in a critical constitutional test like this. So I think it's a very, very serious moment in our history, and I'm glad that the gentleman is convening discussions like this on the floor. We've got to make sure that this investigation, that the professional law enforcement personnel who do this for a living are allowed to do their job so that we can all learn the truth, whatever that may be. The question is, what are they afraid of? What are they hiding? This investigation is going to answer that question, and we'll all accept that answer, whatever it may be. But we've got to let the system work, and I thank the gentleman very much for his leadership tonight.
And we'd yield back to the chair.